800 years ago, the world government somehow managed to defeat Joyboy in the ancient kingdom. So what is it that will make Luffy succeed where Joyboy failed? Despite how amazing we all know Gear 5th is, it obviously still has its drawbacks, and Joyboy was able to use that same form, but still lost anyways. If the endgame villains are meant to live up to their 26-year build-up and counting, I think it's fair to say that Luffy probably has a little ways to go to actually take them down. And after getting a glimpse of the abilities that the leaders of the world government possess, whether that's Imu's shadow-esque powers or Saturn's Ushi Oni form that he summoned with a pentagram circle, it sure is a fair question to ask what Oda has up his sleeve for Luffy as we wade deeper into the final saga. And that is exactly what we're here to discuss today. So make sure to drop a like, and while 100% of my viewers are some absolute legends, 90% of you also didn't hit subscribe last time you were here, and there's really no better way to support the channel, so I'd really appreciate it. Now, it may be hard to imagine anything beyond Gear 5th since it is his fruit's awakening, and it's ultimately what told Zunisha that he was Joyboy after all. Luffy said that he was at his peak in this form, and that all-white transformation with the red-ringed eyes is what is recognized as the Warrior of Liberation, so I can't see that form going away entirely. Plus, there's the whole marketing of it all. This is way too iconic to go away from this late in the game, so I don't think we'll see another gear past Gear 5th, such as Gear 6 or Reverse Gear or something, which may relieve as many of you as it disappoints, but I think we will instead see another variation of Gear 5th that utilizes some other things we've already seen before in the story, which kind of makes sense because the gear system has given us so many amazing transformations over the years, and even within those pre-existing gears, Luffy tends to find different alterations or ways to improve upon what he already does. Of course, we have the variations of Gear 4th with Bound Man, Tank Man, and Snake Man, but Luffy even got better at activating Gear 2nd and also reducing the drawbacks of Gear 3rd during the time skip. Even if there is no Gear 6th, there is plenty of room to work within Gear 5th itself to get stronger and surpass what Joyboy was ever able to accomplish with it. And that's where another transformation that Luffy has used before comes in, one which tends to get forgotten about when we think about what might happen in the future, and that is Nightmare Luffy. This form is often lumped in as something kinda specific to Thriller Bark and Moria because the Kage Kage no Mi was kind of involved in the shadows even being available. But the thing is, not only is Moria active in the story again, but so is his Seraphim, who's probably named S. Gecko, who may also have those same powers since it was a Paramecia type fruit. And maybe most importantly, we know Imu's abilities are at least kind of shadow-esque thanks to the attacks on Cobra and Sabo during the Reverie. Even on Egghead, we still aren't sure what this random shadow was in 1075, nor how Saturn summoned himself with this dark pentagram circle like that. I mean, there also needs to be a reason why the government ever kept tabs on Moria so closely and even went through the trouble of tasking Doflamingo with killing him, an order that came from higher up than Sengoku. At the very least, Oda's dancing around the idea of bringing shadows back into the fold, so the potential for Nightmare Luffy to make a return is definitely there. If we get even one of these people to separate some shadows, then we're in business. But the best part about this is that Nightmare Luffy was also dubbed the Warrior of Hope, a perfect juxtaposition to the sun god that we now call the Warrior of Liberation. We also know Luffy is a guy who is all about pursuing dreams, which is what makes using Nightmare mode so ironic. Oda built a perfect inversion to Gear 5th more than a decade before it ever came out, especially given Nightmare Luffy more or less defeated Ors, an ancient giant, and Gear 5th Luffy defeated Kaido, who is an Oni himself, which could very well be connected, and who also beat Moria way back in the day. I mean, Moria even got Ors from Wano in the first place, which connects that all even more. We know that shadows are also tied to wills, and Luffy awakened his fruit, at least in part, because of the will that his fruit had. And I think the inversion between these forms is even illustrated in how the powers physically work, because where Luffy stretches to his own will with his devil fruit, Ors had to stretch to Moria's will when using Shadow Revolution. We all know Luffy wants to be the freest pirate on all the seas, and his fruit lets him be free in a very physical sense because he can stretch himself at will, and even things around him when he uses his awakening. But the key there is that it bends to his will, to his imagination. Ors had to stretch because of someone else's imagination or someone else's powers, creating a very twisted version of Luffy's powers that really aren't that free at all, since Ors had to listen to Moria's commands. This version of stretching quickly became a lot more about control control rather than freedom. And given that Imu has powers that at least aesthetically look similar to Shadows, someone who clearly opposed the Gear 5th using Joyboy in the past and has controlled the world for 800 years, maybe there's a little bit there that can even tell us about the Void Century. But not until I get to tell you guys about the sponsor for today's video, Pocket Champs. This is one of my favorite mobile games out right now because it's all about strategy. It's 100% free to play, and it works by coaching your champ to give them the best chance in each upcoming race by training them, leveling up your gadgets, and then laying back and just watching them race. All of your decisions come before the race even begins. One of the biggest factors for that though is your gadget, which the game comes with tons of these things and they all work a little bit differently, meaning that some may or may not work very well with the race that you're on. The turtle bot is probably my favorite one in the whole game, but if you use it on a race with a lot of land to run on, you're probably toast. They've also released new content every month since launch, so you'll always have something to look forward to. So why not start coaching your champ today by downloading the game using my link in the description or with the QR code here on screen in order to earn 500 gems and the white wolf skin, which will be added to your account on November 1st, 2023. This is a $15 value and it's only available till October 31st, so make sure to go download it today. And thanks again to Pocket Champs for sponsoring, but let's get back to the video. But I want to back up a little bit first and talk more about why Luffy needs a power-up like this. Because while we all probably recognize that Luffy has at least some kind of ground to cover before defeating the biggest bads of the series, or at least he should if they're to live up to all their hype, a lot of you probably also thought, well, can he just improve his haki to close that gap instead? And I think he absolutely will do that, and even needs to do that. But I also think that ironically could help him use the nightmare form again in the future. Three of the biggest forces that we still have to defeat in the story, being Blackbeard, the Gorosei, and Imu, all have some kind of leg up on Luffy's Devil Fruit powers specifically. Blackbeard can nullify Devil Fruit powers, something which he has done to Luffy already, and the top brass of the world government are very familiar with how Luffy's fruit works. I mean, the Gorosei are the ones who gave us the explanation in chapter 1044. They defeated Joyboy at some point in the past, so they probably have a good idea on how to handle him this time around as well. That necessitates Luffy improving beyond his fruit even further, I think, and haki is the most obvious answer for that, especially when we've recently seen what Shanks is capable of, and we know that he and Luffy will meet eventually. Whether it's canceling people's observation haki, using Wi-Fi haki like we saw after Wano, or even being able to one-shot someone like Eustace Kid, who is definitely somewhat of a disgrace, but I mean, Kid did tank several attacks from Big Mom and Kaido, so it goes to show that there's levels to this thing when it comes to haki, and Luffy's definitely gonna have to keep improving. But when it comes to defeating the biggest villains in the story, I don't think it can be just that simple, especially when Oda's introducing things like summoning circles like we saw with Saint J. Garcia Saturn. Oda is showing us new things here in the endgame, and that could challenge Luffy in very unique ways. I mean, during Egghead, we also saw Luffy try to fight a hologram, however he was unable to hit it without using Vegapunk's photonic gloves. And Atlas also mentioned that the debate between what's real and not is as old as time. Luffy may find himself in a situation one day where he has to kinda think outside the box in terms of this haki and devil fruit paradigm that we become accustomed to in the story. But instead of working outside that system entirely, one which Oda's built up for 26 years, I think there's going to be a new way to combine the two that puts Luffy in a tier of his own. And this is what a future Gear 5th nightmare form could be. Where Gear 4th used armament haki to enhance his rubber powers beyond its normal limits, I think Luffy will basically do the same with Gear 5th, except we replace that armament haki with shadows, which are honestly two concepts that are tightly linked as it is. And I think adding other people's shadows could almost be viewed as a way of channeling other people's haki or will in addition to your own. Your shadow contains your will, which is tied to haki in general, and if you go back to when Nightmare Luffy first happened, the Rolling Pirates told us that Luffy could handle as many shadows as his spirit could handle, which if I read between the lines just a little bit, then that could also be saying that the stronger your will, or maybe your haki, then the more shadows you may be able to hold within your body. All of the haki training that Luffy went through from Thriller Bark until whenever this potentially happens in the future could vastly increase either the total number of shadows that he can hold, or maybe the quality of the shadows that he can possess. Like I said before, we saw in Egghead that there were holograms Luffy was unable to touch. Shadows should kind of work the same way, I think. It's almost like a reverse hologram, where it's an absence of light. However, they basically become physical entities once separated from the body that contain a will very similar to the original person's. Perhaps there is a way to manipulate that shadow on your own. Or maybe Haki is just tied to your shadow in the first place. Top tier Haki may just let you manipulate your own shadow, which is something that Parvision has also theorized on a number of occasions, and I'll definitely leave a link to those videos down below. But all of this is just to say, it's definitely possible that Luffy is able to achieve Nightmare form once again. So then let's talk for a minute about just how devastating Nightmare Gear 5th Luffy could actually be. Because in Thriller Bark, Nightmare mode didn't just give Luffy some upper hand, it gave him a dominant advantage in that fight. Leading up to its introduction, we saw Oars was just wreaking havoc on the crew, and this all happened right after Moria used his shadow to let Oars stretch like Luffy. But then Nightmare Luffy came in and stopped him literally one-handed. He swung him around by his hair and basically punched him all around the island. But remember, not only did his strength increase many times over, he also gained different combat abilities than he normally had. The first shadow that he ever received was from a strong marine swordsman, and we immediately saw him use a sword successfully for what was probably the first time in his life, honestly. And the last time in his life was probably later on when Nightmare Luffy slashed Oars. Now imagine Luffy gets this ability to use different combat styles than normal, but he still has the Looney Tunes-esque powers from Gear 5th. Oda would get to go as deep into his bag as he could ever imagine by letting Luffy's imagination help him with stuff like sword fighting if he gets a swordsman shadow, sniping if he gets a sniper shadow, or really anything depending on what kinds of shadows Luffy puts into himself. This would not only put Luffy on a tier likely worthy of beating anyone in the series, but also offer a lot of fun variation within Gear 5th without actually unlocking a new gear or anything like that. Gear 5th was said to be only limited by Luffy's imagination, and I think to some degree that his imagination would expand greatly with various types of shadows within him. I don't think any of us would say that Luffy can imagine how to fight with a sword. I mean, he had the Nidai Katetsu literally in his hand during Wano, but just punched someone instead. But once he would have a swordsman shadow added to him, then he can imagine how to use it, which is exactly what we saw in Thriller Bark. So Gear 5th could just get somehow even more interesting than it already is with this factor in mind. For example, we've already seen him grab lightning from the sky before in Gear 5th, and at least in the anime, he was even bouncing around the lightning to pick up speed. Well, imagine if he got Nami's shadow at one point. That would give him some additional knowledge in how weather works, and most notably, how lightning works, and that could let him use it to his advantage even more, and maybe even create bigger lightning attacks somehow. Or earlier I mentioned how Luffy got the shadow of a marine swordsman. Well, what if he got the shadow of the future world's strongest swordsman, Zoro? When you add in the strength and Looney Tunes abilities of Gear 5th, that could make him an absolutely absurd swordsman to face off against. Imagine 3 sword-style Nightmare Gear 5th Luffy, which is a mouthful, but the fact that it could actually happen is incredible. If he got Sanji's shadow, he may get a power-up if a woman was ever in danger. Or maybe he just gets better at utilizing flames in his attacks, which we know Luffy already does from time to time. But Sanji has Ifrit Janbei now, so who knows what Luffy could do. If he got Brook's shadow, maybe he too could channel the chill of the underworld. Or if he got Jinbei's, maybe there's a chance we could see Luffy utilize Fishman Karate. And the thing is, Luffy could get shadows from the whole crew, not just one at a time. Luffy could take all 100 shadows that the Rolling Pirates had before, so even though the crew's shadows may be a bit more hard to control than most because of their strong wills, Luffy should have the propensity to utilize them all at once, and maybe the fact they're friends comes into play too. I mean, the crew already wants Luffy to be the Pirate King, so their shadows might just want to help Luffy at that point. This could provide some kind of beautiful moment where Luffy letting his crew chase their dreams throughout the story comes back to help him in a big way because he would get to tap into their expertise that they developed over the journey. Maybe we get a moment where the crew's basically all defeated, all hope seems lost, which is something we've experienced many times before, but through one way or another, Luffy's able to take all of the crew's shadows as a way to get one last fighting chance. Almost like a shadow version of a spirit bomb in a way, which I could admit would have to be done right to not seem at least a little corny or at least a little too convenient, but I think the general idea that Luffy could utilize the crew's different types of battle prowess is just something Oda could cook with and something he would do right if he decided to do it. And to be clear, I don't think Oda would ever have Luffy defeat Emu or Blackbeard or anyone major with this form, but rather it would be something that kind of evens the playing field, which is basically what we saw in Thriller Bark. So in the future, maybe Nightmare Gear 5th Luffy defeats some ridiculous threat that Emu or Blackbeard creates, and then it would just be a normal 1v1 afterward. One example could be something that Randy Troy and I came up with in this video right here on his channel, which is one of my favorite theories of all time, so you should definitely check that out, and this could tie back to what I said at the beginning about Nightmare Luffy being called the Warrior of Hope, tying it all back to the Warrior of Liberation in a perfect way, because typically one hopes to be liberated. One kind of comes before the other, almost similar to how the night comes before the dawn. And I think it's ironic that that's what makes a dream-focused person like Luffy become Nightmare Luffy. It's more than just a dope name. It's almost a representation of the juxtaposition that we're seeing right in front of us. Luffy wants everyone to be free, but at least for the period of time that he uses that form, the owners of the shadows within him aren't really that free at all. Luffy would probably rather those people just have their shadows, but sometimes he may need to use them, which is all an interesting tie to Emu, I think. Luffy calls himself a nightmare when using shadows, but you know what Emu calls themselves? A dream. When Emu was speaking to Cobra, they spoke to themselves in the third person, as Mu, and I think a lot of people clung on to the fact that that can be translated as void, which is certainly relevant as well, but it can also be translated to dream. We know in One Piece that victors always decide the history. The world government has given a bad rep to literally everything that has stood in their way, while also glorifying themselves despite their atrocities. Oda loves to have the truth inverted from what the world tends to believe. I mean, even people on Shanks' crew thought that Luffy was some rampaging demon monkey guy, so it should be no surprise that Emu would also label themselves as a dream, opposite to Luffy, who has called himself a nightmare when also using shadows. And maybe that can provide a deeper connection to everything I pretty much said up to this point. We all know how Gear 5th gives Luffy his famous all-white appearance, but the thing about his red-ringed eyes is that Emu also has red-ringed eyes, although very different, right? Since it alternates between red and black, almost like a red Rinnegan in a way. But I think that a lot of people have forgotten that Nightmare Luffy also had a ring to his eyes, a black ring that appeared on the outside of his eye. If Luffy were to combine Gear 5th in Nightmare form, I would imagine that he should have at least some kind of red and black ringed eye combination, right? Now, I mean, Luffy doesn't have quite as many rings as Emu, but I think the thought itself is kind of interesting. Could that maybe give us a hint to who Emu is, or at least what kind of power they might possess? Because the red ringed eyes have also appeared elsewhere, with the Sulong minks and the energy steroids that Hody used. I don't want to rehash everything that I covered in this recent video here, but it's weird that we've seen 3 ways, all tied to the ancient kingdom somehow, that give people red eyes. Could Emu be from some kind of race, or have used some kind of technology, or adopted some kind of power, or something else altogether that let them use a power that matches or even surpasses all of those? Is Emu a Gear 5th nightmare version of someone else? Maybe one who also ate the energy steroids and used Sulong? Or is Emu just a shadow that was given the steroids or something? Now, we're getting a little wacky here, of course, but there is some mixing and matching of these ideas that I think could be what makes Emu so overwhelmingly formidable. Even when Moria went Shadow Asgard after Luffy was done with Nightmare Mode, which was essentially Moria going in the Nightmare Mode, he consumed what I think was 1,000 shadows at once, compared to Luffy using 100. And we even see his eyes turn red and way off into the distance like this. Maybe Emu is someone with a bunch of shadows in themselves right now. Maybe even more than 1,000. Maybe like a whole planet's worth. Perhaps the Void Century was all about Emu taking shadows from opponents around the world. So admittedly, we're getting a little tinfoily here, but there are probably a few videos out there, mine included, that break down the insane parallels between Dressrosa and the world government. Doflamingo was an ex-celestial dragon, the Tentata have history going back to that time period, which is really some of the most key information we have on it so far, and the Don Quixotes were one of the 20 original families alongside the Nefertari and Neronas, and even some other stuff. But another potential connection now, given the backdrop of all the shadow talk, is how strings and shadows both let you control somebody's body directly. Strings let you be like a literal puppeteer, which we saw Doflamingo do several times during Dressrosa, and shadows basically let you take that one step further by manipulating their body's shape and size. We saw Doflamingo use his ability to create what is, in my opinion, one of the hardest scenes to watch in the entire series, which is when King Riku is being puppeteered as he goes through the city slaughtering his own subjects. And what made this so awful was that Doflamingo even manipulated him into asking for all of their money first. Given the connections between Dressrosa and the world government, could all of this be a sign of what the Void Century was really like? Could Emu have used shadows to recreate a very similar situation to Dressrosa, but around the entire world? I would even argue that Doflamingo has even been framed as a kind of counter to Moria in a few subtle ways. For one example, like I said earlier, earlier, Doflamingo was the one tasked with taking out Moria due to a command of someone higher up than Sengoku after Marineford, and we also knew that Doflamingo essentially worked for Kaido, while Moria went and fought Kaido directly, and lost miserably, but at least he tried. And also, Moria and Hogback tried to sew oars back together so that they could resurrect him, but then Doflamingo used his strings to sever the leg of Oars Jr., kind of inverting that whole thing. And then we even saw Doflamingo and Moria Seraphims together going toward Empty Bluffs. And another way to tie them together is that Luffy also required a brand new form in order to defeat each of them. For Moria, that was a combination of Nightmare Luffy as well as combining Gear 3rd and Gear 2nd together after that. And for Doflamingo, that was of course Gear 4th, which is a form reliant upon combining Haki and his Devil Fruit. I'm sure Imu will represent a combination of many different characters and mythologies and things like that, so I don't want to dumb it down too much, but at least in part, could Imu be a combination of Moria and Doflamingo, where Imu succeeded in ways that both of them failed? If that is the case, then the setup is absolutely there for this fight to be what pushes Luffy to combine the absolute best of his Devil Fruit, which is Gear 5th, and the absolute best of his Haki, which could very well come in the form of shadows eventually. In Dressrosa, Luffy was once controlled by Doflamingo strings, and he had to go into Gear 4th in order to break them, a form that again uses Haki and his Devil Fruit at the same time. Perhaps there will come a time where Luffy is controlled by Imu's shadow or something, and he has to use this new form to break out of that. Could Joyboy have been controlled during the Void Century just like King Riku was in Dressrosa, except instead of strings, it was shadows? And could being able to break out of that via nightmare form or otherwise be what helps Luffy succeed where Joyboy failed? I mean, think about how ironic this would all be if the theory that Oars is Joyboy is actually true, which I'll leave a link to Marshall D. Preach's video on that topic down below. And to be clear, this would be the Oars before the Thriller Bark Oars, because Oars Jr. had Oars the Third on his flag. So that tells us there's another one we haven't met yet, and given the Oars and then Oars Jr. names, it's probably the one before either of those, I think. And the reason that this would be ironic is because in Thriller Bark, we would have had Oars, a potential relative of Joyboy, being controlled yet again, but this time, he had the next Joyboy shadow within him. And since Luffy needed to use other people's shadows to enter nightmare form in order to defeat him, or at least almost defeat him, maybe that's a hint for the future. Like Luffy will again need the help of other people's shadows to fight back against Imu or somebody. I'm gonna dive deeper into the Void Century stuff in a future video, because especially after what we learned in chapter 1095 in the Native Cleansing Festival, there's a lot more that I need to dive into, and this is already like 30 minutes as it is, so make sure to go click subscribe so you don't miss out on that one. But now I just want to finish off this video by discussing kind of when this form could happen and what Luffy would need to do with it. Because as I said earlier, this form wouldn't be something that actually defeats Imu or any other major villain, but rather it would just level the playing field. When Luffy first used Nightmare form, he didn't even fully beat Oars. He just got him one big hit away from doing so. Nor did he defeat Moria. Nightmare form is almost a cheat code in the world of One Piece. The power that is granted is kind of obscene, and Oda would never threaten the climactic ending of One Piece with something so sudden. But it's just something that serves as a means to kind of nerf the opponent a little bit, and let the good guys get organized and generally flip the tables so that an eventual comeback doesn't feel like a total ass pull. And again, there's no doubt Gear 5th is amazing. I mean, that hit on Kizaru was nice and all, but if that's all Luffy could do before going out of Gear 5th, then how is he actually going to defeat people that we expect to be even stronger? The biggest villains in the whole story. He's a sitting duck right now in Egghead, and Frankie had to save him. And meanwhile, we see Saturn healed himself, held Vegapunk, Frankie, and Sanji in place with who knows what, and it looks like he can shoot people just by looking at them. So if or when Luffy uses some kind of Nightmare Gear 5th form in the future, he's gonna do something that makes beating all these people believable. And I think the way he does that is by destroying both Marie-Joie and the Red Line. In a majority of the major arcs in the story, Luffy's actions somehow lead to the destruction of a major structure or headquarters that the villain of that arc said was important to them. And sometimes it's his own doing, or it's just kind of the situation that he causes. Like in Wano, Kaido's mansion within Onigashima got destroyed, which he actually complained about during the fight, and also back with Odin. And then in Whole Cake, Big Mom had the Whole Cake Chateau destroyed, as well as her wedding cake. And then in Alabasta, it rained as soon as Crocodile lost, which starting a drought using the dance powder was a big part to his entire plan. And there's even some other good examples, but there are two that really stand out here more than any other. Obviously, one's going to be from from Thriller Bark, but the other one is actually Arlong Park, where Luffy basically realized that destroying the map room, and by extension a lot of those painful memories for Nami, was necessary to free her, and in the process he also defeated Arlong. And when Emu dropped the Mother Flame on the Lucia, we saw that Emu also had a map, one that I could only assume is something very close to a map of the world, except for maybe where Laugh Tale is, which would be kinda cool, and creating a map of the world is Nami's entire dream. Nami and Emu also have some other really weird connections, like Emu backwards is Umi, which means sea, and Nami means wave. They both have an affinity for dropping giant lightning strikes using other people's technology, and I just think that Luffy will come to a similar conclusion about Emu like he did for Nami, that destroying Marijois, the Red Line, and all of the stuff that essentially keeps Emu up there controlling things is necessary to free them. Now, I'm not trying to act like Emu will be redeemed in any way, but just that maybe physically destroying the place around Emu is actually necessary to free or defeat Emu for good. And then in Thriller Bark, there's a really interesting connection, because when Oars first got Luffy's shadow, he acted just like Luffy would, including putting a piece of a building on his head as if it was a hat. And what do we know is deep within Marijois? A giant straw hat. Maybe Luffy will one day put that straw hat on while rampaging there. And maybe the more important thing is that Oars messed with the rudder of Thriller Bark and sent it off course, on a path out of the Florian Triangle and into the sun. Within just the few minutes that Oars acted like Luffy, he put all of Thriller Bark, which is a giant landmass that was cast in darkness for who knows how long, on its way to the sun. And in doing so, that almost caused his crew and others on the island to vanish into nothingness without their shadows. So perhaps defeating Emu will require a similar idea, destroying the Red Line, destroying Marijois, and giving Emu nothing to hide behind. Oars was called the Continent Puller, and a lot of us think that could tie to Wano's different climates, which is reasonable honestly, but the Red Line also has different climates in very much the same way. Perhaps Luffy also becomes a Continent Puller by pulling the entire continent that is the Red Line straight out of the ground. It could be almost like Luffy is doing to Emu what Emu did to Joyboy and several other places, literally erasing the land that they once called home. And so those are all the reasons why I think we will one day see Nightmare Luffy make his triumphant return. But before you go, remember to check out Pocket Champs by using my link down below or the QR code on screen to get 500 free gems and the White Wolf skin. And please make sure you drop a like and subscribe down below, and maybe even go check out this video that I dropped on the 3 ancient weapons. But until next time, later.